As the walls of Jerusalem still lay beneath the shadow of dawn, the city was already encircled by an invisible judgment. Beyond its gates, the mightiest army on earth had settled like a silent plague. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, hardened by blood and conquest, stood ready to advance. They came under the command of Sennacherib, a king who believed himself a divine instrument, certain that no wall, no people, no God could stand in his path. They surrounded Jerusalem like vultures circling a body, awaiting its final breath, convinced the name of that city would be erased from history before sunrise. Yet as spears aligned across the plains and enemy fires lit up the night, within the city walls, a king knelt. Hezekiah, descendant of David, placed no trust in numbers or weapons. In the silence of the temple, among ancient columns and incense-laced air, his voice rose. He did not plead for vengeance, nor for glory. He asked only for intervention, a solitary cry, cast into the unseen, rising through the darkness to reach the heart of the eternal. In that moment, the heavens answered, not with thunder, not with armies, but with a single messenger, an angel. He did not come to wage war. He came to judge, and wherever he passed, resistance ceased. The pride of empires was silenced, fields became graves, and the generals, who only hours before had toasted with goblets of stolen gold, would not live to see the dawn. This is not a tale of warfare. It is a tale of judgment, of a God who heard the prayer of a king and with a single act shook the mightiest force the world had ever seen. Jerusalem, surrounded by death, was delivered not by blade or shield, but by a presence that moved through the tents like a whisper that kills. And by morning, the valley was strewn with corpses who never had the chance to raise their own swords. The earth began to tremble while the night still held its breath. The gates of Jerusalem no longer opened to landscapes. They opened to a sea of armor. Tents stood in rows like gravestones. Campfires flickered like watchful eyes. Spears jutted skyward like accusing fingers aimed at the chosen city. The siege was complete. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers blanketed the surrounding valleys, becoming part of the land itself, a wrathful extension of the desert. No escape, no promise of relief. Only the clinking of chains, the chime of steel, and the muffled laughter of men already convinced of their victory. Inside the city, the streets were far too silent for mourning. Women whispered by the glow of oil lamps. Men stared into the dust as though answers might be hidden in the cracks of the ground. Children were hushed, each voice a threat, as if sound itself might summon ruin. And above them all, King Hezekiah walked the temple corridors alone. The Levites no longer sang. The altar was clean, the temple dark. The city suspended between dread and expectation. Beyond the walls, the generals raised their cups. Rabshakeh, the voice of Sennacherib, drank as one who had already conquered. Firelight danced upon his face as he recited the names of ruined cities: Lachish, Arpad, Hamath. Places now reduced to warnings and dust. Amid goblets of stolen gold and maps scrawled in haste, the destruction of Jerusalem was discussed like a game already won. There, among the tents of men, victory was toasted before the first blow, and in the pride of the conquerors, God was but a name, one they believed would be silenced by sunrise. But above the plans and proclamations, above the armies and the muffled cries, a different silence hovered over the heavens. Unseen by mortal eyes, a messenger stood waiting. His hands bore no blood, yet his power could shatter mountains. He did not march with men. He did not sleep among them. He awaited a command, and when it came, war would not be waged with spears, nor determined by walls. That night, the field was set. The enemy stood in position. The walls held fast. The people wearied. The heavens silent. And while the final star of night still quivered above the city, something stirred, not among the soldiers, but in the unseen. For what was coming would not be a battle. It would be a sentence. The news came like a dry wind from the south. Lachish had fallen, burned, plundered, consumed like so many before it. The last survivors emerged from the dust with a reflection of horror still etched in their eyes. They were not soldiers, but shadows, each bearing upon their bodies the warning of what awaited Jerusalem. In the palace, the air was thick. Advisors spoke in raised voices, gesturing wildly, sketching plans upon dust-covered tables. Some called for surrender, others urged an appeal to Egypt. No one truly listened until the door opened, without announcement, without formality, and Isaiah entered. He brought no army. He carried a sentence. His eyes, wearied by visions, swept the chamber like one who had seen the end long before the beginning. His beard, white as the ash of extinguished altars. His voice, sharp as a blade steeped in silence. "Thus saith the Lord." His voice sliced the air like a muffled thunderclap. "The king who now threatens Jerusalem shall be turned away by a breath he cannot comprehend. He shall hear a distant rumor, lose command, and return to his own land, where he shall meet the death he has dealt unto others." No map foretold this, no strategy accounted for it. But there, before the most powerful men of Judah, there was no room for doubt. This was no rhetoric, no politics. It was a verdict. Outside the walls, the Assyrians still rejoiced. Rabshakeh, the mouthpiece of Sennacherib, drew near and raised his voice to the watchmen. He spoke with derision, ensuring all could hear. He mocked the God of Israel, the temple, the ancient promises. His words rained like darts upon the stones. But within those walls, something had already shifted, because a voice had risen. And when the heavens speak, not all ears will hear. But those who do know that time has begun to bend. The letter arrived at the palace as dusk fell. It was brief, written with the cold detachment of one who believes himself untouchable. In it, the king of Assyria spoke of the God of Israel with contempt. Every line was an insult, every word a provocation. This was not merely a threat of war, it was a profanation aimed at the throne of the Most High. Hezekiah read the scroll in silence. His fingers did not tremble, but his eyes bore a weight no army could measure. He gave no reply to the envoys, He summoned no generals. He consulted no maps. He walked with the letter in hand into the temple. There, where the gold of the cherubim still gleamed in the lamplight, where incense had long since faded into memory, he knelt, alone. A king without his crown, a man before the sacred. And without ornaments, without speech, he spread the letter upon the ground, before the altar. The silence was dense, the air unmoving. Hezekiah closed his eyes. "O Lord, God of Israel," he whispered, his voice scraping through the stillness. "Enthroned between the cherubim, thou alone art God over all the kingdoms of the earth. Incline thine ear and hear. Open thine eyes and see." His voice was low, but something in the temple seemed to stir. "Sennacherib's words are not against me. They are against thee. He has despised thy name. He has likened thy glory to shattered stones. He has claimed thou canst not save. Show him, Lord, that he is wrong." There was no thunder, no fire. But somewhere beyond the veil, something broke. For the answer would not come in sentences, nor in dreams. The answer was already forming in the heights, silent, irreversible. Outside, the Assyrians readied their war machines. The gates of Jerusalem seemed frail before what was drawing near. But the true impact would not begin at the walls. It would begin in the unseen, where justice stirs in silence. Jerusalem remained awake. No lights flickered in the windows, yet no one slept. Families held their silence, as if every sound might beckon the enemy. Upon the walls, soldiers stared into the horizon, not seeing stars, but distant torches, gathered like watchful eyes. The siege was alive, and the coming day, inevitable. Within the Assyrian camp, there was frenzy. Men darted between tents, delivering commands, preparing the final details for the assault. The ground trembled beneath the rhythm of assembling troops. The offensive was imminent. Rabshakeh walked among the officers, his gaze that of a man who doubted nothing. Everything was in place. The city would fall by sunrise. Inside the city, King Hezekiah remained in the temple. The letter of Sennacherib, blasphemous and proud, still lay upon the floor. There were no crowds, no priests, only a king kneeling before the altar, and a silence heavier than the night outside. The prayer had been spoken, the answer awaited, but it would not come in words. Beyond the gates, the Assyrian army formed ranks. The drums began to beat, softly at first, like the heart before it quickens. Soldiers tightened their cuirasses, gripped their sword hilts. Within moments, the greatest assault ever launched upon Jerusalem was to begin. The city stood on the brink, and then something shifted. It was not a cry, nor a sign. It was a rupture. A sensation none could explain, as though time itself had paused, as though the world, for a moment, had fallen utterly still. It was then that he came. The angel of the Lord did not appear with sound, nor light, but his presence passed through the camp like an invisible blade of judgment. He did not fly. He did not run. He advanced, and life recoiled. The first to fall was a sentry, then another, Within seconds, formations began to dissolve. Bodies collapsed without wound, without struggle, without warning. No one understood what was happening. Soldiers dropped mid-step, mid-command, mid-thought. There was no resistance, no cry of pain, only the sudden cessation of all things. It was as if the air itself had turned hostile, as if breathing had become a transgression. Sennacherib emerged from his tent, bewildered. He called for his men. No reply came. His generals lay sprawled beside the canvas, his officers frozen on their knees. The ground was strewn with polished armor, but none within it drew breath. When the sun at last rose, Jerusalem stood untouched, its walls unbroken, its gates closed. No arrow had been loosed, but in the fields, silence told the tale. Where once a vast army stood, now remained only the remnants of shattered pride. 185,000 soldiers dead, without battle, without warning, without a single chance. Sennacherib said nothing when he saw the field covered in corpses. The sun was still low as he stepped out of his tent. He expected to find his generals at the ready. Instead, he found silence, fallen men, open tents, weapons scattered across the ground. No signs of battle, no signs of life. The destruction was total and inexplicable. He walked among the bodies like a stranger crossing foreign land. His officers were there, still wearing their insignia, still upright in memory, yet long abandoned by breath. No blood, no movement. 185,000, reduced to silence. Terror came slowly. It did not seize Sennacherib at once. First came denial, then confusion, and finally, the certainty. Something had descended during the night, something that could not be fought, something that could not even be seen. He tried to issue commands, tried to regroup what remained, but authority had vanished along with his armies. All that remained was fear and silence. By early afternoon, he gave the order he had never thought he would utter: retreat. No one argued. No voice rose in response. Not even the royal scribe recorded the command aloud. Chariots were hastily aligned. The few survivors organized themselves as best they could. Many walked as though in a trance, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their souls broken. There was no glory, no explanation, only a king attempting to return home without admitting he had been defeated by something he could not understand. Upon reaching Nineveh, he ordered the records to be rewritten. He claimed a plague had struck the camp, a sudden illness, a strategic withdrawal. There was no mention of the God of Judah, not a word about an angel, but there were eyes in the streets and ears in the marketplaces. The rumors traveled faster than the messengers. The story of the destruction spread through the taverns of Syria, the ports of Egypt, and the deserts of Arabia. Everywhere, the same phrase was whispered: it was the hand of God. In the years that followed, Sennacherib surrounded himself with altars, offerings, and rituals. He tried to smother the memory with gold and sacrifice. But what had happened that night could not be buried. The prophecy of Isaiah had been fulfilled in part. The other part still awaited him, for he had returned home, but he had not yet fallen. And that too was already written. When the sunlight reached the rooftops of Jerusalem, there was no attack. No arrow crossed the walls. No enemy marched through the streets. The gates remained shut, the ramparts untouched. But outside, there was silence. The first to ascend the high places looked on in disbelief. Where once there had been an army, now there were only corpses. Men lay fallen, still in positions of assault. Entire ranks had been halted in the instant before movement. No sign of battle, no devastation, only absence. The cries that rang out through Jerusalem were not of fear. They were cries of astonishment, of relief, of reverence. The news spread like fire through dry straw. Men rushed through the streets, calling to neighbors, waving from the walls. Women wept in the courtyards. Children ran, unaware of the cause, yet sensing that something had changed. Entire families gathered in the squares, and from the windows, old songs began to echo once more. The people needed no evidence. They had seen. Hezekiah walked the streets, his face still marked by the vigil. His steps carried him to the city walls, where Isaiah was already waiting. The two men looked at one another, and there was no speech. It was not necessary. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The impossible had come to pass. The silence of the Lord had become a visible answer. And so, on that very day, the order was given, "Let everything be recorded." Scribes gathered accounts. They counted the bodies. They described the exact formation of the enemy on the night before. The number, 185,000, was etched into history as both wound and testimony. Isaiah dictated his words with steady hands. His visions, his proclamations, his warnings, now sealed by the weight of an irrefutable miracle. In the days that followed, the walls were reinforced. The springs were secured. The gates were restored. But what was most carefully preserved was the memory. For Jerusalem had been saved not by strategy, not by might, but by something no army could command. Envoys came from other cities. They brought gifts. They pledged allegiance. Even kingdoms that had once bowed to Assyria now looked upon Judah with reverence. But the people knew the power was not in Jerusalem. It was in the one who defended her. And with time, the story became song, then scripture, then legacy. Mothers told it to their children. Priests sang it during rituals. And even when Jerusalem would fall centuries later, even when the temple would be destroyed, that night would remain alive. Because it was not merely a victory, it was a mark, a reminder carved into time that when God chooses to act, nothing remains standing. The night the angel descended upon Jerusalem was not merely an episode in the wars of empires. It was the moment the unseen broke into the scene, when the pride of an empire met the one wall it could not scale, the will of the Most High. Sennacherib tried to erase the traces. He altered the records, rewrote the narrative to preserve his throne. But there are truths that not even kings can bury. The truth endured in song, in scrolls, in stone. And with every generation, someone told the story again. Jerusalem would face storms yet. It would be besieged, destroyed, rebuilt. But that night would become a landmark, not merely for the death of an army, but for the reminder that there are limits even the mighty cannot cross, and that there are moments when heaven replies, not with thunder, but with silence and justice. The hand that saved Jerusalem that night still weighs upon history, and the echo of the angel who walked among the living resounds whenever darkness dares to seize what is sacred. For there are cities that belong to the earth, and there are others that God Himself has chosen to defend.